Well, thank you, Sam. This is Dave. First off, let me make sure you have those packets. As Sam was mentioning, you have a chance to print those out. It's 13 pages is the outline. Let's go to the table of contents. It's labeled letter A before we get into the materials. And let me just talk about what we're going to talk about today. This is a broad topic in the sense that it covers many regs, but we're really going to focus primarily on the Reg D as in boy, Equal Credit Opportunity Act's definition of what is an application, and that's the fundamental of everything that's going to come out of this. And if you look at the table of contents, you'll see the first 5 pages. We're going to spend probably 45 minutes just on those first 5 pages. It's much easier to talk about. I get that in the real world, it's much easier to implement. I used to be an FDIC examiner. I am recovering from that. I was a loan officer, and now for the last 22 years as a consultant. I'm going to tell you, I believe this topic is probably the most misunderstood, and yet it's the fundamental cornerstone, if you will, to all the other regs. Most loan officers will tell you they get it, and yet when we quiz them or see some of their transaction testing and do things, we find that a lot of them don't. And so I'm going to really boil down and try to make this as black and white as possible. There are shades of gray, I understand that, but that's what we're going to work through. So once we get through the first 4 sections and page 5, then we'll start to look at HMDA and other regulations, and then we'll also get in a little bit about, so who can you make sign, although that's another 2-hour webinar. In fact, October 29th, I believe it is, there is going to be a 2-hour webinar just on Join Intent. And really, this webinar and that one on October 29th is really going to be, to me, a 4-hour training that we're breaking into 2-hour segments. So hopefully we'll get into that a little bit today, but I guess I want to give you a little bit of warning. That's not the meat of this material. That's set up for the October 29th webinar. So what we'll discuss and what we won't, as it says on your screen. Now, down at the very bottom of page A, you'll see a bullet there that says anything you see in italics. I'm taking that right from the regulations. Go with me, if you would, to page 1. You'll see that I've got an outline there, Roman number 1, what's an application. And then you notice in letter A where I'm quoting the regs. Now, here's just my rules. Anytime you hear me present something, this always comes along with it. Anytime you see something in italics, I'm quoting verbatim, right from the reg, a memo, a commentary, whatever it happens to be. So at the end of letter A, I also try to tell you where it's coming from. So you'll see in brackets there that's section 1002.2F. And that way you can dig deeper. My mentality is to teach you how to fish rather than hand you a fish. And sometimes I have it right in my head, but when it comes out my mouth, I say it backwards, or you misunderstood what I said, or whatever. There's the source. Don't believe me. You can research it, look it up. You can see where I'm coming from. Maybe there's a memo that I'm not aware of, you're not aware of, that kind of thing. But it lets you know where we're coming from. So, well, let's get started. First off, page 1, what's an inquiry? What's an application? I'm going to drop way back to this cornerstone again, very fundamental. And I'll just give you the cliff notes here quickly. An inquiry, you don't have to do anything. Nothing is triggered by inquiries. We're talking policy. Somebody says, you know, what's your policy on this? And we give a brief answer without telling them whether they qualify. An application is a request for credit where we have to give them a yes or no answer. That's the cliff notes of this now. An application triggers disclosures or denials depending on the type of loan that they're requesting, of course. But that's the big picture. Let's get into the meat of this, and really what's underneath Roman number 1 there is what I'm saying. Understanding the difference between these two is huge. So what is an application? Right from the definition in Reg B, notice it says oral or written request. In fact, if you have a highlighter or a pen, I'd encourage you to underline that word oral. It does not have to be on a piece of paper. If you were standing in front of me, I'm going to hold up, and you could see, just imagine this. I have this form in my hand called an application. Maybe it says credit application. There's another one here that says Fannie Mae 1003. You all probably know what I'm talking about, a 4-page home loan application. That is an application form. It's what we use to document applications, but it is not an application. Now, hear me say that again. A piece of paper is not an application. An application is a request for credit. I can do that verbally. We could do that on a cocktail napkin. We don't have to have that on a piece of paper called an application. And it's really, to me, a 101 level type of comment that we see all the time on the BOL strings where people say, well, I don't have an application. And yet what they indicated was the customer came in and asked for this and this and told them that, and we said yes or no, or et cetera. You have an application. You may not have put it on a piece of paper. Or it's another common thing to say, well, we make them reapply between the construction phase and the permanent phase when we do two-phase financing. No, you received an application in the very beginning, and your bank broke it into two phases. They want to build a house and receive 15 or 30-year financing, let's say. Your bank says, we're going to break that into a construction draw loan, and then we'll term it out into a permanent phase. There's one request from the customer that your bank is breaking into two phases. Two loans does not equate to, can come from one application. You may make them recomplete, further attest by having them fill out another application form 6 months later before the permanent phase. But that is not the request for credit. And I'm going to go ahead and drive this home a little bit. Let's say that your bank has a very attractive construction loan, and you have very high fees on the permanent loan. Let's think about RESPA and truth in lending and all those things. It says give them a good faith and an early truth in lending within 3 days of application. If you just think logically, maybe try to step out of the banker role, excuse me, and go to a regulatory role. When were you going to tell them that you charge 5 points on that permanent financing? After they've done the construction loan? That would be called bait and switch, and that's what RESPA and early truth in lending disclosures are trying to prevent. If you say, well, we make them fill out a new application, that's fine. It's an updated attestation, but it's not the request for credit. They did that 6 months ago. And so one application may get broken into two loans at your bank. Not every bank does that. Some banks do construction perm all in one, and they would give the disclosures for that whole loan. If you take an application and break it into two phases, you are receiving an oral or written request, I'm reading from the italics now, for an extension of credit made in accordance with your procedures. And you're breaking that into two loans, but you've received a request for credit, an application for that extension for the permanent loan already. Now, that's the big picture, yet I'm trying to get into details with you. Now, I've gone a little further than what that italics says. So first off, oral or written request, so it doesn't have to be on paper. If you're taking notes, that's key number one. And then it says made in accordance with your procedures. Now, some bankers will argue, well, our procedures are to make them come back and fill out the second app, or we require this and this and this. Look at letter B1, and there's a commentary to this that says, what are your actual practices? Don't tell me what your policy is. In other words, if you read on, it says for making credit decisions as well as your stated application procedures, your policy. Do you, for instance, on home loans say they must fill out a Fannie Mae 1003, every box, everything's completed, or we don't give them the time of day? If that's your policy, that's okay if you stuck to, well, some regs would say, no, you have to go once you have these 6 items. But it's your actual practices. And so the scenario that I give all the time is someone comes in and has a horrible scenario. They've got this, we just declared bankruptcy last week, or real-life situation. This happened to me once. I'm a brand-new loan officer at the bank. If you've ever done that, you'll know every loser in town comes to see you because you're new and they want to try. So hopefully you're giggling with me, but it's true. Anyway, so in come this person, and they said, we want to borrow some money. And I said, what's the purpose? And they said, legal fees. And I said, can you be more specific? And they said, well, we're going to hire an attorney so we can file bankruptcy. Seriously. Let me show you the door. It was kind of my answer. Is that a request for credit? Yes. Did I say no to them? Yes. I don't have to have them fill out a piece of paper. That's a no. I owe them an adverse action notice. I received a request for credit. Okay? So some no-brainer. I mean, just make it far-fetched like that if you're trying to convince it. What's the actual practices? Well, we didn't fill out a piece of paper on a form called an application. I didn't waste their time or mine. It was my actual practices was to go, yeah, no, thanks, can't do that. Or ask loan officers about telephone. Do you ever take telephone applications? And every one of them will probably say, well, of course I do. How do you do that? Well, we grab a notepad here, and I jot down a few things, like they said their debt and their income and loan to values and things like that. Well, then that's your actual practices. And, well, no, I really haven't received an app yet. I'm just talking to them. Well, maybe not, and we'll get on here a little bit further.